Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, June 17th, 2021. Time for another show. Greg Dworkin is gearing up as we speak. Or, well, if we had spoken a few minutes ago, then I could have accurately said as we speak. He's already geared up. He's ready to go. So, plenty of news stories lined up in queue in the Raft O stories. And, of course, lots to catch up on. And, well, you know, as usual, about 17 hours too few to actually catch up on all the things that are in there. But plenty to discuss today. I don't know if I could pick out the hot item of the day from a mixed bag this morning on Twitter. But in my feed, well, a little bit of chatter about what appears to be, what now? What would we call it? A re-examination of the re-examination? Or is it a re-examination of the re-examination of the re-examination of lab leak theory? Which I guess we've been, I don't know, waiting, 2 weeks now, and no particular additional information that would help anybody reach the conclusion that an enormous amount of important information was, in fact, skipped over in reaching the conclusion that, yeah, it probably wasn't leaked from a lab. But now, I suppose, well, a lot of people who have invested more time in it than I have now saying, wouldn't it be interesting to have to reach the conclusion that instead of a dangerous groupthink glossing over of real information indicating that there might be a lab leak and browbeating yourself over having missed that because of the pervasive atmosphere of groupthink among the liberal media, what if, in fact, the liberal groupthink hysteria was, oh my gosh, we might have missed something on the lab leak theory, and we all need to re-examine everything that we assumed about these stories, only to find out that, well, there really still is no clear evidence one way or the other about, well, I guess not one way or the other. I guess it actually comes out on balance in favor of the original theory. And what was it that made all of these folks in the so-called liberal media rush all at once, not everybody did, of course, to the defense of the lab leak theory, if not exactly the sort of, well, stampede or groupthink or whatever terminology you want to lay on top of it, whatever loaded term you want to use to describe it. So now will they have to re-examine their re-examination? I don't know, because I'm not a journalist, and I won't ask any either, because I really am tired of hearing it already. Quite honestly, you either get the disease or you don't. We either vaccinate people against it or we don't, treat them or we don't when they get sick, or bury them or don't when they die, and those are the important factors. And where it came from, of course, it's important in the sense of, well, if there was anything we could have done to have lessened the impact or even prevent it from happening again, I'd love to know. But if the answer is, gosh, nature's weird, well, then I don't know that we have the answer to that one. All right. Well, let's see. Many more things, of course, circulating this morning on Twitter, including the somewhat, I guess, surprising news that I did see Greg retweet earlier, and it's probably in his stack/Raft O stories, that Stacey Abrams weighs in on the current state of play on voter protections and similar legislation. Apparently, well, I don't know. Was that something you wanted to save? Did you have that in your Raft O stories, Greg?
I do.
Okay, all right. Well, then I'll leave it for you and leave everybody else on the edge of their seats. But maybe not for long. Maybe for up to an hour, though. Just warning you, in case you're worried about the structural integrity, the infrastructure of the edge of your seat.
Do shore it up. Although I'll try not to mine it to get to the point where we take the grid down.
All right. Well, in Texas, that could happen.
Because I have that on the list, too.
At the drop of a 10-gallon hat. And even a 5-gallon hat would probably knock the grid offline in Texas. All right. Well, we'll leave it to you then, because now everybody's intrigued, and what better way to start? Good morning.
Good morning. Well, a lot of different ways we can go. You know, as you were speaking and I was listening to you, it occurred to me that a column I had read last night might be a good place to start.
That's what this show
And this
does.
is a Frank Bruni column with the intriguing title of Ted Cruz, I'm Sorry. And he's not really.
Oh, all right.
But what the article is about is the fact that he's retiring as a columnist. And he's going into academia and he's going to teach. And I don't know if people are aware of this. He's written about it. But he's also losing his sight. And so he's become very sensitive to a lot of different things that, how much time you have and what you can do with the time you have and all that sort of stuff. But one of the things that he writes about is how sorry he is over the last 10 years of writing columns that there were times that he's gotten really super snarky about things.
Oh, no.
And, it's sort of too bad. And maybe he was a little harsh on Ted Cruz. But the thing is, and this occurred to me as you were talking about the lab leaks.
Oh, yes.
He has this paragraph. I worried and continue to worry about the degree to which I and other journalists, opinion writers especially, have contributed to the dynamics we decry, the toxic tenor of American discourse, the furious pitch of American politics, the volume and vitriol of it all. I worry, too, about how frequently we shove ambivalence and ambiguity aside. Ambivalence and ambiguity aren't necessarily signs of weakness or sins of indecision. They can be apt responses to events we don't yet understand with outcomes we can't predict. Oh. And so the pandemic certainly falls under that. The lab leak stuff certainly falls under that. And there's times we just don't know. It's okay not to know. And the thing is that there are people who I can name names, but I watch pundits on Twitter and actually interact with them and point it out to them where they get annoyed when I do, about how some of them are just absolutely sure about everything except, when they're wrong, then they're absolutely sure about the opposite a week later. But there's never any ambiguity. There's never, I don't know, maybe it's nuanced, maybe it's difficult. And I try to bring that nuance and difficulty. And, of course, I do it on the show by talking about a whole bunch of stuff I don't really know that much about. And therefore, it's easy to be ambivalent and bring ambiguity to it because I don't know everything. Okay. So we'll talk about Israeli politics because I'm no expert. And we'll talk about stuff I really don't know that much about, but just because I find it interesting because, I'm a blogger and that's what blogging is. You blog about stuff you think is interesting.
I think so. That's my favorite type.
Yeah.
All right.
It's okay to not be certain about everything. And so this whole lab leak thing was just so stupid. There was no reason to think that it was a lab leak. The fact that you can't determine that it wasn't is a completely different animal. You can't prove a negative. And so if people felt like you glossed over the fact that you couldn't prove it didn't, that's not the same thing as having evidence that it did. And so a year later, what about the time you didn't, account for the fact that it could have happened? Well, do you have new evidence? Well, no, but, you really have to go back and look at it because all these people who were supposed experts said they didn't really think it could happen. And now we realize it could have happened. Well, did it happen? You have more evidence? Well, no, but I'm trying to make a point here. Well, okay. Well, what kind of point are you trying to make? The point I'm trying to make is Trump knew what he was doing. Yeah, I know that's the point I'm trying to make. That's why the whole thing is so stupid.
Yeah. To the extent that was the point, I think it was a waste of time. There's nothing wrong with saying, it was a good idea in light of what the disease was doing to wait a year to ask that.
Trump people are completely immune to that sort of thing. Whereas, liberal, progressive, neutral, everybody else is totally susceptible to that thing.
Yeah.
If you say to a Trumper, you missed something, let me just go on and give you the talking points that I want to get here. I really could care less about that. But if you say it to anybody else, they think, gee, maybe I missed something. Maybe I should go back and look. Complete asymmetry. Yeah. And they know that, and they play that for what it's worth, and they got a week's worth of stuff out of it. And now it's time to move on.
They did, and they got what they wanted out of it, which was, for the vast majority of people, I thought I now have an inkling that Trump was right about something, even though I don't know what it was. Oh, well.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, but the only people who really think that are the people who already thought that. They have their own audience. Everybody else is moving on. And, again, I told you this can go in a whole bunch of different directions. You could take that to look at the 2022 and 2024 political scene. And my theory of the case here is that whereas the
right?
structural issues like the Electoral College in 2024, or the historical issues such as a president losing seats for his own party in the midterms right after he's elected, are things, and they're real, and so is redistricting. Those are things, and they're real. The underlying dynamics of what's going on with the two parties are that they're moving in different directions. The Democrats are relatively popular, in the 40s. Republicans are relatively unpopular in the 20s. The Democrats are relatively united, even though we fight about things like voting rights, and we'll get to Stacey Abrams and Joe Manchin and, all that stuff that we've been talking about on the show for a while. But although we have angst, we're more or less united behind Biden, which is why things pass when they pass. And the Republicans are relatively divided, and I think they're going to get even more so. Sure, you could say, well, it's 85-15, and the 85% are Trumpers, and they've won the party, and that's true. But you can't afford to lose the 15 when you're already on the bad side of a popular vote. You're already losing the popular vote, and then you lose 15% of what you have. That is not a good situation for you to be in when you're going into an election. And, again, we get to see what happens in Virginia. We get to see how the Republicans are trying to play it in a way that, as best as they can, nullifies the most extreme part of their party. We saw it in the Southern Baptist Convention election where the moderate won. We saw that in Virginia where the Republican nominee wasn't nearly as Trumpy as some of the ones that were running. And yet, not only can you not hide that, but when the Trumpy side of the party loses, they don't just go away and say, okay, I lost. Because if they did, we wouldn't be talking about insurrection and what's going on with American politics now in regard to trying to relitigate Arizona and trying to do the same thing in Pennsylvania and so on and so forth. So I think the Republican Party is not only going to stay divided, but going to become more divided. And in fact, despite all of their efforts, drip by drip by drip, stuff comes out almost every week, whether it's the New York Times or the Oversight Committee in the House, to show that, in fact, Republicans were trying to do things that were not so great, and they don't want you to know about it, and they're doing their best to block it, and it's coming out anyway. And so because it's drip, 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 it's just going to continue and continue and continue, and their whole idea of suppressing this sort of stuff is simply not going to work. And so for all of that, I'm not so bearish on Democratic prospects in 2022. I think it's a competitive race, and I think they have a reasonable chance to win. Okay.
Well, yes, you've said as much, and it's good news, and it's difficult to get yourself out of the mindset of, like you've said a million times, we're Democrats. The history says something about midterms.
Pundits, all right, they keep telling you that we're going to lose because they know everything, because they're so sure of themselves. That's why the Frank Bruni article just had so much resonance with me.
Well, I appreciate hearing about it. Frank Bruni, by the way, Donald Trump's second favorite Bruni, I understand.
Oh?
Yes,
who's his
behind
first?
Carla.
Yeah, well,
he's not as popular with her necessarily, but
So
what?
I know nothing.
Oh, you don't know that?
That's
you don't remember that
story.
Okay. Well, you can talk right past it. That was one of the many. Let's see. John Barron figured prominently, I believe, in that story, announcing the fact that Carla Bruni was going to leave the many celebrity beaux she was entertaining for the great and very sexy Donald Trump back in the day. But instead, yes, she married instead Nicolas Sarkozy instead.
Yeah,
it was almost
these things
Donald.
happen.
Yeah.
So the New York Times has this big article. Manchin presents his wish list for a voting rights and ethics bill.
A wish list.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's showing some
Dear
flexibility,
Santa.
says Jonathan Weissman, on major voting rights legislation. Indicated on Wednesday he opposed a blanket prohibition on all voter ID laws in the Senate and would not support public financing of elections. Let's just take those two things. You've mentioned very often that Virginia, your state, in fact, does voter ID, and it's not onerous, it's not awful, so it can be done.
Yeah. Although it's changed over the years, but it's not awful and it's not impossible to comply with, but it does create certain amount of problems.
Sure,
and
everything creates a certain amount of problems,
sure.
but that's not the same thing as this is just awful and we cannot allow it to happen.
Yeah, okay.
Right? Again, the ambiguity and the ambivalence and the nuance, that tends to get lost with you have to do it or you can't do it. Well, actually, there's sometimes that there's stuff in the middle. And as far as public financing of elections, that's fine. And people have an opinion about that, but that's not a make or break thing for me. But he expressed support for statutory expansions of early and mail-in voting that would turn back dozens of voting restriction laws that have passed or are nearing passage in Republican legislatures in key states like Georgia, Florida, and Texas.
That's
like a good barriers.
Thing. Yeah. Bigger
he
barriers.
Also suggested privately that he was working to alleviate pressure to end the legislative filibuster, even though not even his version of a voting rights measure could overcome a Republican blockade. And for weeks, fellow Democrats have complained Mr. Manchin would not say precisely what he needed, but he's now laying out precisely what he needed. Again, part of the thing about the Senate,
now what are we
as soon as a proposal comes up, usually people like me and you, certainly me, the next day is like, I can't believe they haven't decided what to do with this yet. Clearly they need to do this, and then they ought to have it done by tomorrow, by 4 o'clock. And that's not how the Senate works, and that's never how the Senate worked.
True.
Not how the House works either, but the Senate just takes forever because it does. And so sometimes you have to let these things play out. We've talked about this on the show, how you have to have Manchin and Sinema do their thing. And in fact, Sinema's relationship with Portman is actually potentially going to get stuff done, which will be maybe in the next segment. But as far as voting rights goes,
yes,
we have this. And so Stacey Abrams heard this, as you pointed out at the beginning of the show, and told John Berman on New Day on TV that she supports the Manchin voting rights compromise. And another voting rights person who was on board is Rick Hasen, election law guru.
Okay.
Democrats should leap at the chance to take Joe Manchin's deal, he wrote last night in Slate. And, he goes on to point out in detail why it's probably a good thing to do. Yeah, it may not pass yet. It doesn't have everything yet. It's not perfect. Just do it.
Okay. Let's work on thinking about that.
Right.
We've seen the wish list. So we've got the list.
Well, that's what's in the Times article.
Okay. Oh, all right. Not in
on Wednesday, he responded to the criticism with an exhaustive list of provisions for a voting rights, ethics, and campaign finance bill that he could support.
I am exhausted.
And for Democrats, there was much to like. He wanted Election Day to be a public holiday.
That's a good one.
So right after Juneteenth, we're doing it, and unlike Juneteenth, you can actually teach about why Election Day is a holiday.
Right.
He wants at least 15 consecutive days of early voting, 2 weekends, a ban on partisan gerrymandering, and the use of computer models to tailor House districts to a candidate's political party, and a requirement that states send mail-in absentee ballots to eligible voters if they're unable to vote in person, among several other provisions to expand ballot access, scale back the For the People's Act mandated no excuse ballot, but remains pretty broad. Okay. And on ethics, he would maintain many of S1's efforts, that's the For the People Act, the Senate one,
right,
to address the abuses of President Donald Trump, including the mandatory release of presidential and vice presidential tax returns and the divestiture of all presidential business and financial interests within 30 days of taking office. That's a pretty damn good deal. You should take it.
Oh, okay. I mean, I'd like to see some of the details of enforcement, but sure.
Of course, absolutely. And again, it's tax reform.
Forget it. I don't care.
You can do tax reform, and it's probably good and on paper, and those who could afford an army of lawyers will find a way around it, but that's not a reason not to do it.
Right. Give me another reason not to do it. I'm just wondering.
Right. So, you have that. And
yes.
Look, if you can get Rick Hasen and Stacey Abrams on board, I think it's probably true that, it's better to do than to not do.
It certainly changes the tenor of the argument. Yeah, I mean, right. You want to do what, generally speaking, people are going to want to do on the Democratic side, what Stacey Abrams thinks is important. And it's generally become the case that Joe Manchin saying, well, this is a list of things that are important to me, doesn't get the same reception. So she's lending him a little bit of her credibility there. And,
right. And then there's also some, I don't have this article in front of me, but I saw it either early this morning or last evening about some reported phone calls that Joe Manchin was having trying to convince Republicans to give up on the filibuster a little bit and try to come along on voting rights, and he was talking to Roy Blunt. Good luck with that. But again, there's nothing wrong with these guys talking to each other. The fact that Blunt represents leadership and McConnell and probably won't budge, fine, but that's no reason not to talk to him. And so,
as far as that goes.
The point is he's trying. He's not just saying, I'm really going to sabotage this, and when I get my secret calls that nobody knows I'm having with Republicans, I'm agreeing with them on everything. That's actually not the case.
No, although he seemed to be setting them up for some, maybe questionable campaign finance transactions instead.
Well,
which is okay if he does it.
That's exactly right. The fact that a bill like this is transactional, it's the Senate.
Well, that's true. The suggestion was offensive to many, but I don't care.
What if that's what it takes to get it passed?
What if
this is one of these sausage things where you don't really want to know what goes in the sausage, but you take a look at the final bill.
And if you arrest Roy Blunt at the end after he's voted yes, okay, not so bad with that.
So that's what's happening with voting. In other words, it's not dead in the water, and there's still stuff happening. Right. And this may represent the same sort of breakthrough that Sinema, the other person who's been excoriated, may have achieved with Rob Portman on infrastructure. Again, a reminder about Frank Bruni's absolutes, and you're always, as soon as they don't do what you want, you have to then dump on them because, everything's an absolute and there's no nuance and there's no ambiguity and there's no ambivalence because you have to be, totally whatever.
It's a boring article.
We've said this for weeks. This is a really complicated piece with a lot of moving parts. So let me turn to Punchbowl, which is a newsletter.
Those bastards, in an absolute sense. Sorry, Frank. Yeah.
The Punchbowl newsletter is talking about progress on infrastructure. And what they write is there's absolutely no doubt that a bipartisan Senate infrastructure plan is getting some momentum on Capitol Hill. If you're up in the Capitol, you can feel it. Washington Post is writing about this a little bit. The evidence of progress is all over the place. 21 senators are on board with a broadly defined proposal. There's a framework for the agreement that Burgess Everett published in Politico. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell seems modestly interested. At least he's not dumping on it. John Thune, McConnell's deputy, seemed bullish on it. Portman and Sinema will brief members of the Problem Solvers Caucus on the House side, putting House pressure on the Senate. Sometimes works, sometimes done it, but doesn't. But the idea that there's momentum there because they're talking about it is of interest. And all of this motion, and also of interest because it'll have to pass the House eventually anyway, all of this motion and movement doesn't mean they'll get a deal, but it does present an interesting set of decisions for the White House to make. Now, they lay out reasons why Biden should take that deal, because I think the Manchin deal on voting rights is an easier one.
All right.
Why Biden should. One, Biden should take it because he has a lot of stuff to get done, and this is, going to check off the list.
This is
Number two, scratching an itch is fun. Biden wants a bipartisan victory, so celebrate. Number three, anytime somebody offers you $1 trillion, take it.
All right.
Number four, Roy Blunt made a good point a couple of weeks ago. It's easier to get 10 Republicans for something than it is to get the last 3 or 4 Democrats. Think Bernie Sanders.
All
Blunt's
right.
not always right, but he may be right here. And number 5, it's the right thing to do because, we need infrastructure.
Okay.
Now, the reasons Biden shouldn't take this kind of deal. It's a tough vote. It's too cute. Progressives see a trap. They get this, and then they turn around expecting reconciliation, and then they don't get it. It doesn't do enough on climate change, and the clock is ticking. And if you don't get it done now, every day is harder to get your agenda done. All of that is true. But there's a sort of nuanced, ambivalent, well, maybe he should, maybe he shouldn't. There's good things, there's bad things, as opposed to this is terrible, this is great, because, you can say those things, but in real life, your choices aren't always, so clear cut. They're not always so black and white. Sometimes it's a little gray. And here's a perfect example.
All right. Punchbowl.
Right. So I thought that was pretty good. But Punchbowl is by subscription. But if there is a Washington Post piece that is a little easier and more accessible, I will send that along to you because then your readers can click on it. So those are the domestic in the news things, I think, that were, jumping out at me.
Okay.
And then there's the summit. And the summit is dominating a lot of the cable news stuff because you get visuals from Geneva. But it was pretty interesting series of dueling press conference yesterday. Putin didn't look all that comfortable. He was a lot less smirky than he was when he was meeting with Trump in Helsinki.
Well, he's funnier.
And Biden did what he needed to do. He had a very good meeting with the G7. He had a good meeting in Brussels with NATO and the EU. And then he had this summit, which, it's Gary Kasparov was all over him, like, why do you elevate Putin? Well, Putin's there, whether you elevate him or not. Yeah. And, it's when you step back and look at it, Hillary Clinton was making these points this morning. What did Putin get out of the summit? Hardly anything, whereas Biden got a chance to say, look, we're going back to business as usual, not the way we did it with Trump. And that's a big deal. And you need to know that. And the world knows it. And I'm telling you that right now. And so it's a reset. Europe is saying, well, fine, but what happens afterwards? I mean, we love it. We love you. We love what you're doing. But there's no guarantees that Trump won't come back. So what are you doing about that? And, of course, that's going to have to be, well, you'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, we'll deal with that here ourselves. Probably not going to be announced at any international summit, although it would be great if it was.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind.
International Court of Justice, for instance.
Yeah, we're going to invoke the Hague.
Right. If you want to talk about what we're going to do
for
about
all the people that wanted that for George W. Bush.
Sure. Well, we'll get to that too.
Right.
Time to reevaluate.
That's really what's been in the news. After the break, I'm going to tell you about Bitcoin mining and the grid in Texas, because we're going to continue on our Let's Talk About Things that Greg doesn't know anything about.
Oh, all right. Well, that's a good one. Everyone is interested in Bitcoin in some way or another. I understand one of the RNC's fundraising arms, maybe the NRCC, said they're going to start taking cryptocurrency donations, which will be great for campaign finance transparency, I'm sure. Probably just a gimmick, but interesting one nonetheless. So maybe after the break. We'll be right back. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We're back with Greg. The other side is here. Bitcoin was where we left off. Everyone loves Bitcoin. No one loves Bitcoin, but I don't have any.
Well,
but
Elon Musk.
No time I'm going to get to it. Oh, Elon. Well, he loves everything because he can buy anything. It's great. Being Elon Musk, walking around being able to buy anything you want, I suppose would be fun. Those are the kinds of people. If you're looking around, like who is it that says, I love getting up early in the morning and I can't wait to get to work. Like I love going to work. I could never imagine surviving without my work. Yeah, billionaires probably feel that way. Like going to work is fantastic for them.
People have noted, on their deathbed, nobody ever said, "Gee, I wish I had worked more."
Right, even them. But okay. So what's up with yes, we were with Bitcoin / cryptocurrency in general.
Well, I haven't really been following the cryptocurrency stuff. I'm not all that interested in it. I don't speculate. I don't know anything about the market. But what caught my eye, and I didn't fully understand and still don't fully understand, is the idea that when you have these supercomputers creating Bitcoin areas on the computer, they take a ton of energy.
Yeah, that much. I get that. I don't.
Okay.
After that,
and so when you do that, the people who buy the algorithms to set up Bitcoin don't necessarily know much about what the algorithms say. They're not engineers any more than somebody who buys a computer and is really good at blogging, knows how a computer works, and can program. Those are separate things. But when you start to do this and then put this together in order to make money, because you sometimes get paid in Bitcoin and say you can make money doing this, you become a Bitcoin miner. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin mining uses a lot of energy. Now, here's a story in Deseret News. Bitcoin miners fleeing China as part of the cryptocurrency industry's great mining migration could begin setting up their high-energy digital digging operations in Texas, according to CNBC at least. The exodus of Chinese Bitcoin miners is the result of the country's environmental policy efforts in Texas, with some of the lowest energy prices in the world, according to CNBC, could be the new frontier of crypto gold rush. Now, Bitcoin mining doesn't take place in a real mine, but it's the creation of the cryptocurrency by powerful computers that verify and track digital Bitcoin. Most miners don't even understand the complex mathematics behind the verification process. Instead, they buy the software and just run it. And in April, China was home to around 65% of the world's Bitcoin mining, with America ranking second with a little more than 7%, according to the University of Cambridge. University of Cambridge tracks this stuff. We'll get to them just for some amusing everything is local sort of stuff. Yeah. But, the point is that we have governors like Greg Abbott in Texas who are promoting mining. It's going to become a real industry in the U.S. It's going to be incredible. Said Brandon Aravanagi, a self-described cryptocurrency specialist and former crypto exchange security engineer. Texas not only has the cheapest electricity in the U.S., some of the cheapest in the globe. So what they're looking for in terms of raw materials is energy. Yes. Okay. This one is from NASDAQ, how Texas is becoming a mecca for Bitcoin miners.
Mecca? Oh, my God, don't tell them they're becoming Mecca.
Right, exactly. Compared to many states, Texas energy rates are inexpensive, although there are a few states that are slightly cheaper. There's still a strong selling point for Bitcoin miners, but energy supply problems with no end in sight as the population of Texas grows is a potential problem.
Yeah, I mean, they just have the most
they've
expensive
got some grid
energy?
issues.
Yeah, It wasn't that long ago before they were saying, but our energy costs 50,000 times what everybody else's does because it rained or something.
Right. So this is a journal called ACM, acm.org, Trusted Insights for Computing's Leading Professionals. And the headline caught my eye because I read that and said, well, why does cryptocurrency use so much energy? And the title of this article is, Why Cryptocurrencies Use So Much Energy.
As if they were listening to you.
And what to do about it.
Oh, wait. That's creepy. Maybe they were.
All right. Maybe they were. Through it all, the world is focused on how Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies can implode and go to zero or make you rich. But the mining process creates Bitcoin uses more energy than Serbia. And in fact, it uses more energy than Argentina. To give you an idea of how much energy is being used here. And the thing that amused me is that this is an American article and says the mining of a single Bitcoin block, a block of transaction data on the Bitcoin network, consumes enough energy to power more than 28 U.S. homes a day.
Okay.
All right. So one of these things, I don't know operating for how long, a day, a month, a year, consumes enough power to power 28 U.S. homes. So they're trying to make it so that your audience who's reading this, who's not necessarily technically savvy, understands how much energy it takes. Yeah. Well, that didn't do it for me, so I turned to the BBC.
Yeah, I didn't. Okay, 28.
Right, households. Bitcoin consumes more electricity than Argentina. They say they have a thing about Argentina.
That seems like a lot.
Right, and then in their analogy, in the BBC, trying to give you an idea of how much energy this takes, the energy it takes to make Bitcoin could power all the kettles used in the UK for 27 years.
That might be a lot.
Okay, now I get it. I mean, you're talking about making tea.
Yeah, and they're constantly making tea.
Right, exactly.
You can't stop these guys with the tea. All right. Interesting.
On the other hand,
just give up your tea.
It also suggests the amount of electricity consumed every year by always-on but inactive home devices in the U.S. alone could power the entire Bitcoin network for a year.
Oh.
Because you have all these devices that you think are off but aren't really off. They're still listening to you,
Oh, right, and finding you articles before you even know it. That's interesting, too. Good point. Like, you're all going to be shaming Bitcoin miners, and the reality is that we're all using that amount of energy, too.
Right. So, in this environmentally conscious world, I think these are things to think of. But all of that was sparked by an article I saw in Texas Tribune. Governor Greg Abbott says power grid better than ever as Texans are asked to cut back electricity use.
Like Baghdad.
Yeah.
It's
A
better than
number of
ever.
power plants were inexplicably offline at the same time that Texas was experiencing record June demand for electricity. ERCOT, which is their local homegrown, not connected to the rest of America grid, they're still working to determine why. They've asked people not to use air conditioning for the rest of the week, for example. The Electric Reliability
tragedy.
Council of Texas, that's what ERCOT stands for.
ERCOT Center at Disney World.
Yeah, is urging conservation through Friday as a number of power plants were inexplicably offline at the same time as the state was experiencing record June demand. They still haven't said so many power plants are unexpectedly offline. I was just trying to figure out whether the power grid is under attack here by usage because of Bitcoin.
Oh.
Because all the miners moved there, and now all of a sudden there's enough power.
I
And
guess
so
if
the
they
grid's
did it all
failing
at once. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it wasn't long ago that we found out, like, cold weather means Texas can't have electricity.
But
And
also
now,
hot weather means Texas can't have electricity because
Right.
everybody uses air conditioning. And
seems
now
like
it turns out that spending money
either one or
means
the
that
other.
Texas can't use electricity because who knew?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And Bitcoin, I think, will probably exacerbate that. I guess if everybody moved. Not only does it use a lot of power to do the computing, but it also uses a lot of electricity to cool the computers that are doing all the computing. So the air conditioning, I don't think they can turn their air conditioners off for a week and still mine Bitcoin. Or for that matter, process your Amazon orders or whatever else we might be doing online. Huh. Well, Greg
Anyway,
Abbott,
things of
I don't
interest
know.
that catch my eye.
That guy.
Now, here's some other things of interest that catch my eye. Also,
Sure.
completely different. Now for something completely
We
different.
don't know why it happened. It just
This
did.
is in Politico. The GOP hands Democrats a new line of attack. They're for Trump over the cops. A wedge has started to form between House Republicans and law enforcement after the January 6th Capitol riot, and their opponents are ready to make the most of it. Republicans, for example, don't want to meet with Capitol Police. They keep shunning them. Capitol Police are ticked off about it. They keep talking about it.
Yes.
Representative Andrew Clyde of Georgia recently downplayed the insurrection by comparing it to a normal tourist visit. But as more and more information comes out about it, that becomes less and less applicable. No longer operative, as Ron Ziegler used to say about a Richard Nixon thing that turns out to be not true. That dynamic was on full display in the Capitol Wednesday. That was yesterday, as D.C. police officer Michael Fanone, who suffered a concussion and heart attack while fending off the mob, visited the Hill seeking meetings with the 21 Republicans who voted against the bill to award a congressional gold medal to police officers for their service during the attack. Fanone says freshman Representative Andrew Clyde of Georgia refused to shake his hand after the officer introduced himself in an elevator.
Are we okay shaking hands now?
It's hard to accuse Democrats of defunding the police when you're dishonoring the police, Eric Swalwell said in an interview. It makes me wonder, was there prior support in the GOP for law enforcement or just phony political pandering? Because when the rubber meets the road, they're choosing Trump over the cops. So if you think defund the police was like just a bad political slogan, how about not meeting with cops and refusing to shake their hand? How does that fly?
Yeah. Well, logic. That might not work.
Republicans aren't sweating it because they don't sweat anything.
Right.
Right. Oh, well,
think you're
because
right there.
Andrew Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, and so we don't have to deal with it, they say.
Yeah, I mean, that also
Who
probably
knows?
their
But, at
approach.
the same
We'll see if
time,
if
talking
it
about
works.
having a little law and order problem here. This also from Politico. I don't know if you saw this. In secret recording, a Florida Republican threatens to send Russian-Ukrainian hit squad after rival.
I did see it, and Kate Sherrill sent that on in the KITM hashtag column, too, so I'm glad that came up.
Great. I really thank you, Kate. I really don't want to have to end anybody's life for the good of the people of the United States, but if it needs to be done, it needs to be done, William Braddock says in the clip. This is by Mark Caputo, who knows Florida.
You know what? I approve entirely. I'm going to start doing that with people. That's crazy. What? And I like that he mixed it,
crazy.
though. It's a Russian-Ukrainian hit squad. That's
Republicans are
diversity.
the party of law and order, and they totally support the police
bet.
and, and hit squads.
Right. I mean, maybe some of those guys
And
work for the
Russian
police in
Ukrainian hit
Russia.
squads at that. Not that there's any connection between the Republican Party and the Russians.
Yeah, or Ukrainians. And, wow, that's, did the Russian-Ukrainian hit squad know that they're up for this job, or...
I don't know. So, how Biden handled questions at the press conference yesterday was one thing, and then there's this guy. Asked repeatedly via text if he mentioned Russian-Ukrainian hit squads, Braddock wouldn't give a yes or no answer, saying he'd not heard the recording and it's allegedly made, but there's no proof.
Oh, it's the Access Hollywood play.
He also suggested the recording may be altered and edited. So, yes, it's the Access Hollywood play indeed.
Okay.
This is a dirty political tactic that's caused a lot of people a lot of stress. Yeah, well.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it would cause a lot of stress. I don't know what to say about that. But don't send hit squads from any country. I mean, just pro tip, I guess we could say.
Something like that. So, the Republican Party, as I said in the last segment, still has some major issues to work through in terms of cleaning up and winning everything in 2022. So, again, I wouldn't put it on the table as a definite win for Republicans.
Yeah.
This is one small story in Florida, but, it's Florida. And at the same time, there's a lot of other stuff that's going to come out like this with Russia, Ukrainian hit squads, more at the national level. And that's the reason why Mitch McConnell is just, I don't want to know anything. I don't want to know how the Department of Justice was looking into political figures. I don't want to know what happened on January 6th. I don't want to know which of my Republican colleagues, House side and Senate side, were involved. I don't want to know anything. And, well, fine. And your constituency probably doesn't want to know either, but your constituency is only about a quarter of the country, and the rest of the country is kind of interested.
Yeah. Shoo. What a strange turn that I'm just looking now back at that story. Also odd about that story in Politico is that the story is illustrated with a photo, as many stories are, and it is a photo not of a Ukrainian Russian hit person, let's say, because it could be of either, Anyway, but it's a picture of the alleged target of the hit squad, as opposed to a picture of the guy who said he was going to send a hit squad, which I think would have been a better call for the photo editor.
Right.
That's a little odd.
Again, changing topics here. This is Daniel Schultz, our friend Pastor Dan, tweeting.
That just struck me as odd. Yeah, Dan?
A bit of a hidden story here.
The
Associated Press has a story which reads, in part, members of black communities across the U.S. have disproportionately fallen sick or died from the virus, so some church leaders are using their influence and trusted reputations to fight back and are encouraging vaccinations.
Sounds good.
Now, our friend Pastor Dan knows something about churches, him being a pastor and all. A bit of a hidden story here, he writes. The Biden administration appears to have decided to use pandemic relief to build health equity in underserved communities. That matches the perspective of those communities themselves. This effort is well funded and is set to continue for at least 3 years, he writes. And it's not an accident that the story mentions both church and political groups.
Okay.
People are being intentional about building and organizing infrastructure regardless of the source. And the people I've talked to, Dan says, are quite explicit about building on vaccination efforts to strengthen connections to health services in black communities and keep them after the pandemic. Anyway, personal opinion, not my employer's. Remember this when somebody says, there's no difference between Trump and Biden. There most certainly is, and it's people getting access to health care they need. This is all of interest because any day now the Supreme Court is threatening to take away Obamacare.
Always possible. There's always a suit going before them.
Until it's settled, it's always possible.
Yes.
And I am in no way, shape, or form able to predict what will happen, and therefore, obviously, I'll pontificate about it. But, it was an important observation by Dan Schultz, and I'm glad he made it, because sometimes things happen a little bit below the surface if you're not looking, and it's good to highlight some of this. And this is important because, as CBS Evening News points out, all but a handful of states have lifted most COVID restrictions as cases continue to decline, but health officials are sounding the alarm for those who haven't been vaccinated and are at risk for a highly contagious new variant, which is, of course, the Delta variant, and not new to us. Nora O'Donnell from CBS News points out in the South, there are over 100 counties right now that have less than 20% of the residents vaccinated.
So there's only 15 residents in those counties, but still.
Still.
Yeah.
They travel. Professor Peter Hochtes points out, I'm down here on Zoom or in person, morning until night, speaking with every conservative group who might listen. He goes on Fox all the time. My message, to fight the Delta variant that'll soon consume the South, you need both doses. That means 5 to 6 weeks until fully immunized. Get vaccinated now. This is your last chance.
Yeah, that's a good point, too. A good reminder of how long it takes to get fully vaccinated. Is that you cannot say, okay, you got me, I'm convinced, and then go out and get vaccinated. And
now I'm protected
be safe.
tomorrow.
Yeah, like you got to duck this thing for another 5 weeks before you're...
Well, but in particular, this particular Delta variant we talked about on the show yesterday, you need 2 shots to be protected. With some of the other variants, a single shot is pretty good. And then 2 shots is better. With this one, 1 shot isn't good enough. You really need 2. So you're going to need those 6 weeks after the second shot, which is a month after the first shot. And so you're talking about 2 months before you're protected. So that's why you got to do it now.
How are those 1-shot vaccines doing against it? Is there,
we don't know. Things like the J&J, probably as good as 2 shots, but there's not a lot of information about it because not as many people have accepted the J&J.
Yeah. Well, whoops, we got one. So I'd like to know.
Yeah, no, it's probably fine. Once you have to, in your head, think 1 shot of J&J is probably similar to 2 shots of the others, although we don't know for sure. The one we know about is the mRNA vaccine.
Okay. Well, we got some of those too. So I guess we'll wait. We'll find out. There's still a lot of masking going on where he's working, so that's good.
Right. So, he's got some charts and figures to go with that, Peter Hotez does. And he says, from the beginning, he's been working as hard as I possibly can, trying to close the gap and avoid the creation of 2 COVID-19 nations, high versus low vaccination coverage along partisan lines. But that's what's going on. Okay.
That's a good amount of information, like almost an hour's worth.
And sticking with the healthcare theme here in our lightning round, which unusually is coming at the end of the segment instead of the beginning. This is from the Healthcare 202. 202 is the area code in Washington, and so all the Washington Post things have 202 in their columns.
Very cute.
Power Post 202, this, that, and everything else. I didn't know that until somebody told me, because I'm not from Washington. The Health 202, Democrats devise a way to finally expand Medicaid in resistant states.
All right.
Doesn't mean it's happened, but Lloyd Doggett of Texas says he has a solution. He's going to introduce legislation co-signed by more than 40 House Democrats that'll let cities and counties bypass the state.
Oh.
We got a new homegrown solution to finally get Medicaid to millions of our most vulnerable citizens by empowering local governments to cover the residents and protect the health. So that's interesting.
That will be interesting. I'm sure that will start a new flurry of Republican governors alleging that they're signing executive orders or legislation undoing that.
Yes.
Good.
And so now when they undo it, they'll be taking healthcare away from people, and that'll be a very interesting dynamic for the next election. A lot of moving parts for this election, so I'm not so sure that we know exactly what's going to happen.
No, but the fact that it will hurt them politically probably won't occur to them, and they'll do it anyway, so we'll probably get that. What we can't predict is the outcome.
Taking Medicaid expansion away has hurt them in the past, so if they have any kind of institutional memory, including in Texas, so if they have any kind of institutional memory, it might give them pause.
If they go to look
again,
it up
we're following the Texas special session stuff, and I'm still not so certain that special session is going to happen, and they're going to push through their really draconian we can change the election stuff.
That's a good story, too, because the delay may be their undoing, and that's why you do things like this. Well, we can't delay it forever. Eventually, they can push it through. Well, how about this? Try delaying it and see if they get embarrassed.
Yeah, see if you can define forever. Or see if you can define less than forever. Maybe less than forever is like
sometimes
a while.
That works. Well, okay, so we're depending on the institutional memory of Republicans. That ought to go well for them. If they try to look it up on the internet in Texas, they won't be able to because all the energy is in Bitcoin or something like that. Plus the air conditioner broke. Can't work it, and all right. This may all play out. I think I have something somewhere in pocket. Maybe I can search it out during the next break about that special session and the likelihood that exposure of the agenda weakened enough knees that they just might not come back or might not be able to pull the trigger.
You got that impression because they started apologizing for it and saying we didn't know how it happened. I don't know how that thing got in there.
Right, exactly.
Well, that's not the response of a confident, we're just going to do it.
Right. It'd be over and done with if that was the case.
And then my final piece here, this is Joel Wertheimer,
Yes.
civil rights attorney, his bio says, policy consultant, former Obama associate staff secretary, has a little chart here he put together on the New York mayor race, which, by the way, happens next Tuesday.
Okay. Where is this chart?
Sort of at the very bottom.
Okay. All right. Well, I need a chart for this one. This is a very complicated race. I got you. Okay. Got it.
We now have 4 polls
Yes.
in the last few days that have provided a snapshot of the mayor's race. And here's the top 4 with and without a guess as to how Data Progress's poll goes, because Data for Progress didn't provide ranked choice voting, RCV, simulation. So he estimated it.
Oh, dear. Okay.
Okay. But basically, the average, Eric Adams in first at 30%.
Really? Okay.
Catherine Garcia second at 26%. Maya Wiley third at 24%. And Andrew Yang fourth at 17%. So the front runner, Andrew Yang, is now fourth in just about all of the polls. Marist, for example, Adams 31, Garcia 22, Wiley 20, Yang 17. So without the Data for Progress poll, the average is actually Adams 30, Garcia 24, Wiley 24, Yang 18. Yang is fourth in all of these polls. Wiley's third in just about all of them, are tied. Maya Wiley's making a little bit of a run here.
Yeah,
she's the most progressive of the groups, and this comes from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez endorsing her and other people endorsing her. I don't know if that'll be enough. Eric Adams is clearly the front runner here. And there are other polls, I don't have them in front of me, but clearly showing that Catherine Garcia is very popular in Manhattan, and Eric Adams is very popular in all the other boroughs. The outer boroughs, as they're called.
Interesting.
And for those who are Manhattan-centric, they may not understand Eric Adams' popularity. But that's because Brooklyn isn't Manhattan, Queens isn't Manhattan, Staten Island isn't Manhattan, et cetera, et cetera.
Staten Island isn't even New York.
So that'll be interesting. And yet, in early voting, Manhattan is doing really well compared to the other boroughs in terms of who's out voting. So intention is one thing. Actually getting to vote is another thing. Right. Early vote isn't necessarily same-day vote, but this is not a Republican situation where, our voters come out early, but theirs come out late. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know who's going to show up. We don't know who's going to vote. It's very complicated. This is the first time New York City's doing ranked choice voting. It's going to be fascinating. Not a lot to say about it because we don't really know what's going on. Right. But right now, with a week to go, doesn't look like Andrew Yang's going to be mayor.
I guess not. It will be very fascinating to see what the outcome of this election is and whether it is declared a disaster. Either, and if it is, will it be a disaster for pollsters or a disaster for ranked choice voting? I'm not sure which, but somebody's going to have a damn disaster.
For the Board of Elections, which can never do anything right in New York City. And it's a guarantee, and I can say this as a New York City native, that whoever it is going to be despised in about a month after the election.
Well, I guess that goes along
with
the
territory.
Yeah,
so,
right.
I don't know why you want this job. You're crazy.
The mansion, I guess, maybe? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, some of the people who get the job don't even live in the mansion.
That's true, too.
And the mansion's
Some
rather
of them who
isolated.
get the job don't even live in New York.
It's a lovely house, and it's beautiful, and it overlooks the East River. But, basically you got to walk to get there.
Okay. Well, that's
which is
good for
fine
you
in
these
summer,
days.
but not so fine in winter.
Right, true. All right, well, enclose the whole area and air condition it with bitcoins or something, and we'll solve that problem, I guess, as we come to it.
No, it's like the old outhouse. It's 20 yards too close in summer and 20 yards too far in winter.
Oh, my. That must harken back ways. Yee. Yuck. What a thought. Okay. Well, we'll be keeping an eye on this. What do we have,
common
a week
bluegrass
left?
joke still told.
I guess so. What are we, about a week, you say, away from the last day for voting? The election day, we used to call it?
It's next Tuesday.
Okay. All right. I'll be very fascinated to see how the ranked choice
June 22nd
works
Tuesday.
out.
So, yeah, exactly right. So we're going to see ranked choice voting, and it'll be most interesting to see if the person in the lead becomes not in the lead after ranked choice voting, which is what happened with Jared Golden up in Maine.
Huh. That will be fascinating, and most fascinating of all, not just because it's not the first place to do it, but it's the first time that professional complainers by the millions will have had a chance to get their hands on this technology.
Exactly right.
So, yeah, I'll be very interested to hear what New Yorkers and even the people from Perth Amboy, Staten Island.
Here are my complaints about this election, ranked by
Exactly. First of all, it's
least
a
favorite
friggin'
to
nightmare.
most favorite complaint.
Yeah, that will be. I can't wait. And you won't have to, at least not very long, just a week away. And by the time you return to the show, we'll be 1 day away.
Right. So it's Thursday. It's my last day of the week, and I'll be back on Monday. And hopefully next week we'll come up with a whole bunch of other topics I don't know anything about that we can pontificate about and be absolutely certain.
I'm sure
that we really know what's going on.
It will be interesting. Less predictable even than ranked choice voting. What will be the Republican outrage come Monday? I'd love to do a game show like that where people try to guess.
Yeah, I mean, critical race theory was like so last week. So.
Yeah, it may be burning out at this point. So, good. I would be glad to be done with it. Thanks,
On
Greg.
the other hand, please keep an eye on your school boards and go out and vote at school board elections. They're incredibly important.
It's true, and if you have anybody that's even close to any good on your school board that you've ever supported, you should be feeling sorry for them now because they are fielding outraged emails left and right and being confronted in the streets about this thing that isn't even happening, and they deserve your support for that.
All right, take care.
Okay, thanks, Greg. See you next week, and almost time for us to start the music that will, if you like, cover your exit. If you're whatever. I know we were sensitive about that for a while, but I still have found no way around that, so don't let it bother you. All right, next hour, music coming here. Plenty of things to round up, including Darwin has just sent me an interesting picture from the Recounts Twitter account. He says he's got bingo now. Today in WTF, Noor bin Laden, Osama bin Laden's niece, protesting the Biden-Putin summit in Geneva with a Trump won flag. Didn't really think I was going to see that show up in Geneva, Switzerland, or anywhere for that matter. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Yeah, that is kind of an unusual combination of circumstances, don't you think? I have seen this thing. I don't know how close to the family Noor bin Laden actually is. And I don't know how close I would be to the bin Laden family if I were, A, not dedicated to their ideology, but B, had to carry around the bin Laden name. But I guess she's making do under the circumstances. I imagine that part of the one benefit of carrying the bin Laden name, if you're not proud of it otherwise, I guess would be presumably enough money floating around that you can, one, afford a Trump won flag, which is a waste of money in anybody's book, and two, afford to find yourself on a boat in Geneva floating around with it, and I guess then three, I don't know whether she hired a videographer for this herself or somebody just captured it on a cell phone, but really the combination of factors that goes into pulling off this stunt probably speaks to there still being lots of cash floating around in the bin Laden family. And I guess, doesn't take that much imagination to then say, well, I guess this is one of those. Well, imagine if she was holding up a sign that said, some Democrat had won. You'd never hear the end of it from Republicans. Whereas, in reality, just not a lot of people are going to be paying attention to what Noor bin Laden is up to. But that's because it's okay if you're a Republican. All right. Well, just keeping up with the bin Laden. That's all. And I can imagine, you think that's an odd combination? Because, in the minds of the, particularly these ultra wealthy transactional people like Trump, she's probably pretty Trumpy to begin with. Like, well, the last guy before the former guy, Obama, he killed my uncle. Trump did next to nothing at all with respect to combating international terrorism and certainly Al-Qaeda at any rate. Maybe they could claim he put his focus on ISIS, but that's doubtful too. But, I guess it's a simple calculus if you're Noor bin Laden. One killed my uncle, one didn't even do anything. I'm for the guy who, favors the wealthy and won't try to kill anybody in my family. So I guess it makes a certain amount of sense for her. All right. Just thought I'd point that out. Other stories taking up lots of time and energy, like Bitcoin today. Let's update you on this one. I thought this was not unexpected, but still a little bit unusual, perhaps in the Noor bin Laden vein. I'll turn to Talking Points memo for a write-up of this one because I think it was originally reported by the Wall Street Journal, to which I do not subscribe, and so it's behind a paywall. So we'll take their version of events. Matt Schuem summarizing things for TPM. Oath Keepers leader spent group's money on guns and steaks, disgruntled ex-members say. And I believe I saw perhaps Raw Story also commenting on this as they rolled out their story on it yesterday. And apparently they listed a third line item on which the Oath Keepers leader had wasted money. Hair dye, which I thought was an interesting thing, and it harkened back to to the episode with Rudy Giuliani and his hair dye running down the side of his face as he flop sweated his way through one or the other of his election theft, insurrection press conferences. Anyway, I guess like being a real estate agent, purchasing in bulk hair dye is apparently a trace factor in Republican insurgencies as well. So, okay. I mean, to me, I don't know. Is it even a scandal if the Oath Keepers leader, among Oath Keepers, is it a scandal if the Oath Keepers leader spends his money on guns? Like, they probably think either, I mean, it depends how you look at it, right? Of course we're spending our money on guns. We want to fight the government with these guns, for instance. As Madison Cawthorn says, is entirely possible. That's another story. We can get to that one later, perhaps, if it's worth spending any time on him. But and even spending money on steaks. Well, that's a manly Oath Keeper kind of thing to do. I'll grow a goatee and spend money on guns and steaks. It's obvious, I thought. But apparently it's a problem. And the problem arises, of course, when the other Oath Keepers say, where are the guns? Where are the steaks? How come I can't have any of these things? And if you have any hair dye, I'll take that as well. And they don't get a piece of the action. That's the real problem. Oath Keepers leader Stuart Rhodes spent thousands of dollars that belonged to the group on things like guns and food, disgruntled members told the Wall Street Journal. And I think that takes a lot of the air out of the accusation. Like guns and food, I think most Oath Keepers would be on board with. But, they wanted to play with them and they didn't get a chance. Members of the Oath Keepers make up the largest group of defendants facing conspiracy charges in the January 6th Capitol attack cases, I might say. They allegedly conspired to interrupt the certification of Joe Biden's win. I don't know if you knew that was at the heart of the conspiracy. Yes. And now, tensions within the groups have spilled out onto the pages of a lengthy journal expose, citing current and former Oath Keepers and some of Mr. Rhodes' family members. The journal reported that Rhodes spent Oath Keepers' money on a home deposit, must have bought a new house, I guess, haircuts, okay, you could have flow-bead that, but fine, liquor, again, problematic, probably only insofar as the other guys didn't get any of the liquor, food reserves, and personal riot gear, which I'm sure he wrote off as, business attire. Citing specific bank records, the journal listed Oath Keepers funds spent near the town of Rhodes' former Montana residence. That's an interesting way of phrasing it, but okay. How much did he spend? $12,424 in auto repairs. Okay. You got to have a working automobile, for instance, to run over protesters with. He might have been armoring it up, perhaps putting a cow catcher on the front. $83.50 at a pet store. That'll be difficult to explain, unless, of course, he was getting some of those, teeth-cleaning chewy bones for himself, so that he could keep his teeth clear of tartar while out in the wilderness surviving on just his wits and the hair dye. $504 at a dentist, which again argues in favor of his ongoing problem with tartar and gingivitis, possibly. $886 at a bar to drown his sorrows over his gingivitis. $9,974 at a gun store to shoot the plaque off of his teeth. And $229 at Alley Cat's Nighties and Naughties. And that one I can't explain, ladies and gentlemen. Although, again, I would have thought, his choice of attire maybe tended toward the body armor thing, but, maybe he's got a bit of a night and day thing going on, and he likes to dress up at night too. Which is, by the way, Alley Cat's Nighties and Naughties. That's Nighties, capital N, Naughties. By the way, I guess that's alliterative, so that's why they went with the N as opposed to saying ampersand. On its Facebook page, it describes itself as, I guess this is important because it's funny, a small adult, and it puts that in all capital letters, which means it's dirty, I guess. A small adult shop carrying a lil, that's cute, L-I-L apostrophe. That means very sexy, I guess. I don't know. This is like baby talk adult shop. A small adult shop carrying a little bit of everything. Lingerie, lotions, potions. Lotions and potions rhymes. The N not fully explainable by alliteration in this case. Just perhaps poor English skills. Lingerie, lotions, potions, DVDs with an apostrophe S. Again, they love the apostrophes. Adult novelties, adult capitalized again, not all caps like when they were stressing that it was an adult shop, but just capitalized as though it were a proper noun. Adult novelties, gag gifts, also capitalized. By the way, one of the gag gifts that you can buy at one of these adult stores is an actual gag. So, that's a little literal for my taste in terms of if you're trying to do a gag joke gift. But okay, all those things and more. So it could just be that he has a, expensive sense of humor. You really don't know what he was buying there, although I'd love to find out just for fun. The Oath Keepers also spent $275 on phone games and $256 at fragrancenet.com, the Journal reported. Wow. The Oath Keepers' former IT manager, Ed Wilson, told the Journal he left the organization after alerting the board to the spending issues and seeing no change. He used that thing as a piggy bank, Wilson said of Rhodes, and you don't want to know what he used his real piggy bank for. Let me tell you that right now. Another former Oath Keeper, Billy Simmons, said he discovered upon calling the Oath Keepers' credit card company that Rhodes had bought an AR-10 rifle, not AR-15, folks, an AR-10 rifle for around $1,000, spreading the payment across 3 days to avoid crossing the card's daily spending limit. That suggests that he knows he shouldn't have been doing it, but again, I'd like to, I guess find me the Oath Keepers that object to his buying an AR-10. And, that's as much, although, well, that's as much a sex toy for him, I'm sure, as anything he bought at Alley Cat's as well. And again, the real point here is, well, I want an AR-10, but you don't see me taking people's dues money to buy it with. Former Oath Keepers director Scott Dunn said the group's board set the $350 daily limit on the credit card, after Rhodes spent $800 on groceries, including more than a dozen steaks and kettlebells at Walmart, so he could lift weights and be tough, I guess. That's a good idea. Again, I thought they were into the purchase of food, but usually just the freeze-dried stuff that lasts for months for their survivalist bunkers. I guess a dozen steaks doesn't fly. Dunn and Rhodes separately suggested the pair go on Tinder dates and bill the Oath Keepers. Okay. Weird. I would suggest, by the way, farmersonly.com dates is a better idea. The yet another former board member, there's a lot of formers, Rick Moon, recalled the directors confronting Rhodes about spending Oath Keepers' money on gas purchases and a train car load, that's the way it's in quotes, a train car load of rice and beans. I created this organization. It's mine, and I'll do what I want to do with this, Rhodes responded. Moon recalled to the Journal. That usually doesn't fly all that well with the board, and I guess they've had problems with him before, and they put a control on it, and all he did was split up the payments on his guns so that it didn't get detected. But then guess what? It got detected. Now, on top of all that, Dunn told the Journal, Rhodes failed to report a $10,000 donation to the Oath Keepers from Gary Heaven? Heaven? I don't know. It's like heaven, but spelled with an I at the end rather than, not Heaveni, but instead of the E at the end, Heaven in heaven. This is Heavin. I don't have any idea how you pronounce that. But more important to you will be, who is this person, and can I boycott their business so that they don't have $10,000 to give to the Oath Keepers anymore? And the answer is many of you possibly could. He is the founder, as it turns out, of Curves, the fitness franchise, which is kind of interesting. Would you have guessed that? Because I think it's marketed almost entirely to women, and sort of a suburban women's workout place, and I think they'd be surprised to know how much of their money is going to the Oath Keepers. Interesting. So anyway, several board members said Rhodes spent supporters' donations without reporting them. So he would just pocket the donations and spend it on himself without even letting the organization know that they had gotten that money. That's amazing. Rhodes and an Oath Keepers attorney, Kelly Sorrell, had responses to nearly all of the expenses listed in the article. This should be good. Heavens, I don't know. Donation may not have been properly recorded, but it was used for Oath Keepers purposes, Sorrell said. The gun purchases, she said, were partly, quote, advertising. An interesting way of looking at it. I needed a gun to parade around with in order to advertise that we were tough. And the gags and dildos were just, window dressing, I guess. Just saying. I don't know what they bought there. It might have been lotions and potions, okay. The food, she said, was for Oath Keepers in Virginia, where they don't have food, presumably. And Rhodes, she said, was merely trying to cheer up the recently divorced Dunn with the Tinder dates suggestion, and whatever might have come from alley cats, I guess. Rhodes told the Journal the allegations of misused funds were petty, stupid, and salacious. They are salacious. And that they came from disgruntled people that have a bone to pick. And that was his idea to use that phrase, not mine. I'm quoting. Rhodes hasn't been charged in the January 6th attack. There's no evidence he went inside the Capitol or anything else. And he has maintained his innocence in the legal sense. But prosecutors frequently refer to his, that is, person one's, communications with rioters in court documents. He's an unindicted co-conspirator, I guess, in these things. What's more, Sorrell told the Journal, federal agents served Rhodes a search warrant and seized his cell phone in April. What do you mean? I don't know why. What's more about that? But okay. The warrant, according to the report, sought evidence of planning, preparation, or travel to breach the Capitol, including weapons procurement or, quote, tactical training. Well, they got him on weapons procurement anyway. So at least there's that. I don't think this affects the case against them. It's just sort of amusing that they're now fighting amongst themselves. And they love fighting, so they should be very happy about that. I mentioned briefly that there was cause to call upon the execrable Madison Cawthorn for a story today. In brief, more surprising developments in, what do we say, adventures in being a conservative Republican these days. Things that you never thought you would see endorsed by conservative Republicans as public positions. According to Madison Cawthorn, at the moment, the Viet Cong, now among the pantheon of Republican heroes. They are true Second Amendment heroes in his telling. Jason Campbell captured this for Media Matters for America and circulated it and made it famous. Cawthorn, basically, I don't know, who's he talking to? Someone on Newsmax here. I don't know any of the Newsmax people, but it doesn't matter. Madison Cawthorn displaying a fine-looking, lopsided Floby haircut that I guess was supposed to make him look like a dapper Nazi. Also not real good at the tie knots, Madison. But he's, about 15 years old. And it shows in his recollection of history here. Madison Cawthorn arguing in favor of Second Amendment rights, a specific type of Second Amendment rights. That is, to say that specifically in his view, the Second Amendment is about protecting the right of Americans to bear the sorts of arms that would make them capable of fighting a tyrannical federal government if it were to become necessary, and he believes it is. Much more so than trees, as a matter of fact, which he frequently punches on video. At any rate, he goes on to say, in answering the objection that is frequently heard by gun enthusiasts when they say, I hoard weapons to fight the government, people sometimes say to them, I doubt you'll be able to outgun the government, so maybe you need a better excuse for hoarding weapons. And he says, if anybody ever wants to say, oh, well, citizens with a few small arms, it says with a few small arms fire. So he's sort of jamming together all the phrases that are dancing around in his head. A few small arms, that would be the proper way of saying things. Small arms fire is something that you say when you're trying to sound tactical, as they say. But anyway, he jumbles it all up. Oh, well, you know what? Citizens with a few small arms fire would never be able to stop the federal government. He says, I absolutely disagree. Ask the Viet Cong how they handled the Marines and the Army in Vietnam. Now, the Marines and the Army aren't actually the federal government, and we didn't exactly bring the full might of the United States federal government to bear in Vietnam, but we brought plenty, that's true. I don't know how Vietnam vets are feeling at the moment about the idea. Some of them will just, be on his side regardless as some sort of reflexive thing, and others will, of course, reflexively be repulsed by someone like him. And there in the middle, I assume there's a persuadable middle of people who will say, hey, wait a second, I don't know that I would have held up the Viet Cong as Second Amendment heroes, but this is a new theory for Republicans, and I guess they'll have to decide whether they'll endorse it or not. The idea, it's a new twist on the old stabbed in the back theory, right? Now we've been stabbed in the back by the Second Amendment, which doesn't even apply in Vietnam. But anyway, if you really wanted to take, of course, a more factual look at things, you might, for instance, take a look at how many Vietnamese and Viet Cong were killed in the Vietnam conflict versus how many Americans were killed in the Vietnam conflict. Too many on both sides, of course, but the ratio ran, I don't know, something probably in the order of 10-1 against the Vietnamese and their small arms fire on that question. So I'm not certain that it proves the point, and I am certain that it was a pretty stupid and insensitive point, but anything in service of guns and tacticalness. So there you have it. Representative Madison Cawthorn, ladies and gentlemen, enshrining the Viet Cong in the pantheon of Second Amendment heroes. I just never thought we'd see it, is all. But then I never thought we'd see Bin Laden people supporting Trump and Trumpers being happy about that. What can I tell you? On other fronts around the country and around the world, but really basically the country, we have news from The Guardian, which is, of course, part of our Around the World section. Republicans move to block inquiry into Trump's DOJ secret data seizure. Just by way of keeping you up on that story, why I had to turn to The Guardian for that, I didn't have to. It's just the first one across the transom, so I marked it. Democrats are pushing for investigations into Trump's Justice Department for data seizures from Eric Swalwell and Adam Schiff, among others. Top Republicans, at the same time, moving to block that Senate inquiry into the Trump Justice Department's seizure of data that was aimed at hunting down leaks of classified information, fearing a close investigation would damage the former president. And who cares about him, right? Remember, by the way, that they also voted to acquit him in his impeachment trials because it didn't matter he was now a former president, and we shouldn't concern ourselves with him anymore. And so this too, I mean, I guess they might say, see, we don't want to look back on this either. But I was wondering if they'll ever get to the point where they say, well, he's a former president, and it doesn't matter what happens to him politically. But I guess with him threatening a comeback, they feel like they have to continue to cover up. So there you have it. Let's see. In fiery remarks, Mitch McConnell criticized the rapidly expanding congressional inquiries as unnecessary and accused Democrats of embarking on politically motivated investigations. And Republicans never do those things, so you can see why he'd be so upset about that. I guess this will become Republican orthodoxy fairly shortly. There's a whole, article that goes with, of course. I'll provide it for your perusal offline. I think it's just, at this point, more important that we note the fact that it is happening, and that's it. A interesting point put forward by Josh Marshall, also at TPM. It's actually his place. And in his, under his own byline, he makes this interesting note about yesterday's somewhat disappointing revelation from, Gregory Meeks, chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is that right? Saying that they weren't particularly interested in pursuing the translator's notes from that Helsinki summit between Trump and Putin. And then, of course, throwing in the we want to look forward, not backward phrasing, and that drove everybody crazy. But Josh had an interesting point to make on that front. This morning, meaning yesterday, ABC News reported that Democrats are no longer seeking translator notes for President Trump's notorious meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki in 2018. The Biden administration is looking forward, not back, said House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Gregory Meeks. There we go. A phrase which is likely more grating to Democrats than any save bipartisan compromise. Probably true. I will say that I am at best meh on the Biden administration's management of the Trump accountability issue. Not surprisingly, this report is being greeted with pretty intense consternation, but there's a part of this I don't think people are figuring on, and this is a good point. Put simply, Biden doesn't need to seek the transcripts or try to talk to the translator. Like, we've forgotten that part of it. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to get a hold of these things, but, generally speaking, the House Foreign Affairs Committee would be banging away on this with hearings and inquiries and possibly subpoenas, if and only if the administration in charge of, given custody of these notes, if they even exist, was in Republican hands. It's not. But also don't forget that it's not in any way, shape, or form a given that a Biden or otherwise Democratic administration would give those notes over, because remember, there's institutionalists out there who will say, well, it sets a bad precedent in the future. What if a Republican Congress starts requesting records of meetings that President Biden took part in? Of course, if you have nothing to hide, et cetera, et cetera. But, there may be strategic issues that it's better to not reveal out of context or otherwise to the American public. So anyway, the point here he's making is that to the extent that we are trying to get to the bottom of what happened. Oh, actually, I should read the prior paragraph here. Put simply, Biden doesn't need to seek the transcripts or try to talk to the translator. He already has the transcripts. That's the key point. The moment President Biden took the oath of office, he, as president, took possession of all the records of the United States government. That definitely includes the notes of that meeting, if there are any, or Trump didn't eat them along the way. To the extent that we're trying to get to the bottom of what happened, there's no need to go through a process of the Congress trying to get access to those notes. So, in that sense, Gregory Meeks is, more or less irrelevant to the situation, whether he wants to look forward, backward, or sideways, right? Like all administrations, though, this one remains leery of setting precedents for future congressional oversight, so it may not want to turn them over. But again, Secretary of State Tony Blinken can probably ask for those notes and be reading them this afternoon. Well, yesterday afternoon anyway. Of course, that applies to his boss, Joe Biden, through whose authority Blinken works. I don't think this necessarily solves the question or the problem. Have they done this? We don't know. Though it's a bit hard for me, Josh Marshall, to believe either man would want to go into today's meeting, that is yesterday's meeting with Putin, without knowing as much as they could about what was discussed or promised 3 years ago. And this isn't the entirety of the matter. As we've discussed in other contexts, accountability almost always must mean public accountability. So there's the question of letting us know what happened there too. Will that happen? Don't know yet.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. There was just one sentence or two left in the TPM piece here, but just to sum things up here, right? We don't know yet whether or not the fact that Biden himself or anybody in the Biden administration with enough security clearance can, in fact, now get a hold of those records if they still exist. We don't know if they've actually done it, but there's good reason to believe that they may have studied whatever notes there were before heading into a meeting with Putin that took place yesterday. So there we are. If it's not enough to have one appointee or bureaucrat know these answers, if we can trust that they will avail themselves of the opportunity to look up the answers, these are fundamentally political questions about the nation's future. As the sovereign authority in the republic, the public needs these answers in order to govern. I doubt very much whether we'll see those things, but yeah, at least I suppose there's something to fall back on there. And I guess to the extent that the Foreign Affairs Committee would have been interested in the notes, well, they certainly don't need to spend 2 to 4 years pursuing the notes only to be rebuffed at every turn by the courts, or continuing appeals in the courts, even if they win in the courts, and then find themselves unable to produce the papers in the end anyway, when the administration can just as easily hand those over if they see any value to doing that. But a good point. It doesn't answer ultimately what we should be doing, but a good point from Josh. And now, speaking of the courts, I bring you the news that's broken over the past half hour or so. Mad Hatter, our friend, has sent this along, forwarding us the tweet of Mark Joseph Stern, staff writer at Slate. Slate having a big day here on the show. Breaking news, the Supreme Court throws out the challenge to Obamacare, holding the plaintiffs all lack standing. So somewhere Armando is having a party, is driving along and hit the brakes as he did there. And I don't know. And elsewhere, I guess others shout, "Thank you, God!" Yeah, and suppose there's all sorts of reasons for celebration. I guess on the Anti-Affordable Care Act side, we have this.
Well, what the hell is supposed to do, you moron?
Right. Well, you're supposed to.
You lose.
There you go.
Good day, sir.
That's the end of it. I think that's it. Certainly, seen a lot of people. I kept this tweet on screen here from Stan Dorn. Let me just open it up so we get all the facts on who we're talking about here. Stan Dorn, Senior Fellow, Families USA, working on healthcare since the 80s, as a matter of fact, and has this to say: yes, implicitly, the Supreme Court is saying that it's time for the ACA wars to end. It's time for partisans to stop trying to take away health care from millions of people. Instead, leaders from both parties should focus on practical solutions that lower families' health care costs. That's nice. He was saying that in response to Elliot Fishman, who had written that the Supreme Court ruling on standing is saying the mandate, remember that was what this was all about here, the mandate to buy insurance that originally in the ACA would result in a tax penalty if you didn't buy insurance, but then the fight over whether or not that was a form of taxation in itself, and then the amendment of the act lowering the penalty to zero, thereby basically eliminating it. But Republican opponents of the Affordable Care Act instead still hitching their wagon to that because there was nothing left for them to do to challenge the entirety of the act, insisted, well, even at zero, it's an unfair direct taxation and therefore blah, 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 something, something. And the court has basically said, now, you're on your last leg and we're taking it away from you. The ruling on standing is saying, Elliott says, that the mandate does not exist anymore, which is exploding the bad faith argument at the heart of the suit. This is not just a technicality. It is a strong substantive rejection on the merits of the constitutional challenge. And so I guess for normal people, the challenges are perhaps at an end. But the Republicans who continue to challenge the validity of the Affordable Care Act are not normal people. So, okay. Yeah, let's see. Oh, here's, in fact, speaking of Armando, he's retweeting Southpaw's, NYC Southpaw's discussion of things, saying the first case announced this morning by the Supreme Court, the ACA case, plaintiffs do not have standing. Armando immediately on the case. The plaintiff in none of the ACA cases had standing, which proves my theory that standing is made up BS, in which he copies me. So, fantastic. I'm glad I got the message here. We'll put it aside so I can share it with you all in the roundup. That's the basic news that I think everybody was waiting for from out of the Supreme Court. There were some other cases out there, none of which are of the same sort of import, I would say, as this one. So there you go. And perhaps that's something that we'll see whether Armando is motivated at some point to talk about that. Maybe tomorrow we can give him the room he needs to discuss it, as today we're working with just a limited amount of time left. Speaking of which, how will we fill that time? I've got a few other stories available, some of which I think I have to click through to find out what they are because they are in tweet form, and Pocket doesn't like that. Yes, here's one. As a matter of fact, yesterday we spent some time reading Norm Ornstein's piece about how he disagrees, say, with Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema about the idea that the filibuster fosters, the presence of the filibuster fosters or forces bipartisanship. And he wants to put a fine point on which one it is. He says about Norm Ornstein's piece that it's a pretty good one. The filibuster, he says, is often framed between enabling obstruction versus forcing bipartisanship. The filibuster doesn't foster bipartisanship, which is generally speaking the argument that Manchin usually makes. But he says that's different from forcing bipartisanship. That's actually a pretty big distinction, and he goes on to explain it a little bit. As Norm Ornstein points out, Josh Huder, does he say Huder, perhaps? Huder, senior fellow at, GAI Georgetown, but I couldn't tell you what GAI is, but sounds important. Anyway, as Norm Ornstein points out, Josh says, cloture cannot facilitate bipartisanship where it otherwise wouldn't exist. That is, there's no magic in all of this, right? Political incentives outside the legislature largely create those conditions. For example, And I think this is a good example, right? Thinking of Joe Manchin saying, well, we love the filibuster. I want it to stick around. He doesn't necessarily love it, but I'm not going to fight it because it requires bipartisan cooperation in order for any legislation to move forward. It creates bipartisanship and forces it. But again, that's not the same thing as bringing people together on the merits of anything and having them agree. This is just, well, if we want anything, even a piece of crap bill that only, addresses a fraction of what we need to get to because we can't get to the real thing, then fine, we'll do it. It's not the same thing. So as Norm Ornstein points out, cloture cannot facilitate bipartisanship where it wouldn't otherwise exist. Political incentives outside the legislature create those conditions. For example, the House, for instance. Remember, we don't want to turn the Senate into the House. The House is a majoritarian body that nonetheless passes several significant bipartisan agreements each year. I mean, that's just true, right? We see it happen all the time. In the House's chamber rules, there's no filibuster, of course, right? The House's chamber rules don't create bipartisanship. It can't, because there isn't any rule that would force it the way the filibuster does. Political interests, though, just align on some issues. In other words, the House is able to create bipartisanship and bills with bipartisan support all the time, even though there's no such thing as a filibuster here. So the filibuster can't be the magic creating bipartisanship. Otherwise, the House would never pass anything. But in the Senate, if Congress is to address at least non-budgetary issues that could otherwise, deal with under reconciliation, if Congress is going to address anything that can't fit under reconciliation, it must be bipartisan because most legislation requires a 60-vote majority. In previous eras, forcing bipartisanship, I guess, did not entail complete obstruction on many issues. Enough moderate constituencies and cross-party cleavages enabled bipartisan negotiations and increased procedural forbearance. But looking for a process capable of overcoming today's geographic polarization and safe partisan seats is a fool's errand. Partisanship is baked in, and all the forced bipartisan processes in the world won't change those incentives or enable bipartisan solutions. I think that's pretty interesting. There is a last tweet here. If there's any lesson politicians should take from all the recent failed bipartisan processes, super committee, regular order, open floor processes, etc., just because you force people to sit together doesn't mean they'll eat together. So, a good point, and a fine one to put on yesterday's Ornstein article. Thought that was worth bringing up. Let's see. Other issues worth our time. This I thought we would get to yesterday, and we never did. Again, seems like obvious stuff, but I think Greg Sargent puts these things in a nice and succinct way and expresses our thoughts. I thought I was clicking on this yesterday, and I landed on the Ornstein article instead. He was tweeting around his opinion piece from yesterday. House Dems just released new info detailing Trump's corrupt pressure on Jeffrey Rosen, Barr's replacement, we talked about it briefly yesterday, to use the DOJ to subvert the election. This will get worse. Sources tell me Rosen is in talks about sitting for an interview. He can tell us much more, so we look forward to hearing that. The best nuggets are sorted out here in this tweet thread, but they're all contained in his piece from yesterday. The more we learn about Trump's corruption of DOJ, the worse it gets. True. Another day, another extraordinary revelation about Donald Trump's efforts to corrupt the Justice Department. Remember when that was a problem? We're now learning that as president, Trump went to far greater lengths than previously known to actively recruit the department in his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And by the way, this registers with me as a point in support of the proposition that this is a Republican theory of governance, And this is the direction that future Republican administrations will go, especially if we do nothing to intervene and hold people accountable. You may recall that the George W. Bush administration had, basically broken the world's record previously for most politicization of the Department of Justice. And it did include elections manipulation as well. Remember that they were putting loyalist U.S. attorneys in place around the country with the idea that they would bring, of course, election and voter fraud cases against Democrats all over the country, laying the groundwork for precisely the problem in which we find ourselves entangled right now. In case anybody thought that it was Trump that invented this idea, it was not. But I think you all know that pretty well. But that, again, rings the bell with me when we note that this being an extraordinary revelation about Trump's efforts to corrupt the Justice Department. I said way back when that the next Republican administration would just do the same and worse, and here it is right before us. Anyway, this comes after we learned last week that during the Trump years, the Justice Department subpoenaed the phone records of 2 House Democrats, right? Possibly as direct retaliation against 2 of Trump's most prominent political foes. But the latest revelations push us into terrible new territory. First, they fill an important new detail demonstrating that Trump absolutely did fully intend to thwart a duly elected new government, the one chosen by the people, from assuming power in order to seize a second term for himself illegitimately. Second, there is reason to think that in this case, as we learn more, the revelations are going to get worse. Here's why. There is a chance that House Democrats will soon secure an interview with the person at the center of these new revelations, and that person is Jeffrey Rosen, who became acting attorney general after Barr was pushed out by Trump in December of 2020. If an interview can be secured, Rosen can tell us more about Trump's efforts to corrupt the department in order to subvert our political system and self-rule. Rosen, we're now learning, was a key target of Trump's efforts to get the department to help him overturn the election results. Democrats on the House Oversight Committee just released a tranche, if you will, of new emails and documents revealing how Trump did this. The department turned the documents over to the committee as part of its ongoing investigation into the January 6th insurrection. Among the key revelations, Trump's White House assistant sent Rosen an email on December 14th that included materials purporting to document extensive election fraud in Michigan. The email included talking points that said there must be a review of votes throughout Michigan. Just after this happened, a senior Justice Department official forwarded a similar email with these materials to U.S. attorneys in Michigan, which seems like it might have been an effort to get an investigation going. That was the idea of the George W. Bush administration, folks, not just Trump. Less than an hour after those emails were sent, Trump announced on Twitter that Barr would be stepping down and that Rosen would be replacing him. Importantly, Trump had already sent Rosen his marching orders in terms of helping subvert the election. On December 29th, Trump's White House assistant sent a draft brief to Rosen, doing all his briefing work for him, and other top department officials that Trump wanted the department to file with the Supreme Court. It called on the court to declare that electors for Joe Biden in 6 states that Trump lost must not be counted. The email explicitly says Trump personally asked for the brief to be sent for those officials' review, a direct presidential order. According to the New York Times, that brief echoed the baseless claims made in the Texas lawsuit that also sought to invalidate Biden's electors, which the Supreme Court had already dismissed. This shows Trump was fully devoted to subverting the election outcome, no matter how fraudulent his legal claims were revealed to be. Essentially, he wrote up a complaint that, it was nonsense and had already lost in court, but he basically just wanted those guys to sign their names to it and submit it so that he could then say, it's not me, it's the Justice Department of the United States of America says such and such a thing. There's lots more here, including additional efforts by others in Trump's orbit, such as then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, to pressure the department to examine claims of purported election fraud. As bad as all this is, we may learn there's still worse. That's because, as sources on the committee tell me, that is to say, Tell Greg Sargent, not me. Rosen is in discussion with committee officials about sitting for a transcribed interview. So what might we get out of that? Such an interview could fill in critical details, of course. Among the other things that Rosen could speak to are whether there were additional communications between Trump and Rosen, including verbal ones, as well as unreleased email communications, or perhaps they're on a secret server somewhere, or a private server, but his emails, etc., etc. We know that's okay, though, if you're a Republican. If there were more communications between them, Rosen could fill in additional detail about the full scope of Trump's efforts to get the department to help overturn the election. Those could easily demonstrate even worse and more concerted efforts to corrupt the department than those we already know about. According to committee sources, the department has not indicated that what they did turn over is all that it has in its possession along these lines. Rosen might also be able to say when in the timeline he realized just how serious and deliberate Trump's efforts to overturn the election actually were. And he might be able to say more about possible additional efforts by Trump or people around him to get other department officials to scrutinize other examples of supposed election fraud. The larger context, he says, Republicans are still refusing to agree to a bipartisan commission to examine the January 6th insurrection. This is coming amid widespread claims by Trump and his propagandists that the violence wasn't really all that bad, or they didn't actually intend for the mob he incited to subvert the election's peaceful conclusion through intimidation and violence, or whatever. This newly revealed pressure, though, on the Justice Department came in the days leading right up to that incitement. The more it's revealed that Trump absolutely did fully intend to subvert the election via corrupt and illicit means to remain in power illegitimately, the harder it is to deny what we all saw with our own eyes. After failing to accomplish that via his bottomless efforts to corrupt the process, Trump attempted to complete the task with mob political violence. That's what happened, and the more we learn, the worse it will be. Unless, of course, the more we learn, the more Republicans ignore it, and certain other journalists say, well, both sides, something, and everybody does it anyway. We'll see. I don't know what to tell you about that, but true. And the more we learn and the longer we look into this, the worse it gets. It's just, gosh, I don't know whether we'll be able to do anything with it. And it's awfully difficult to predict the outcome. Let's see. One other item I guess we'll squeeze in for the sake of rounding out the picture. We've touched on the subject a couple of times and never really had a definitive conclusion. But this, I don't know, is this a newsletter perhaps? Maybe. The Brick House, with which I am not familiar, but written by Donald Shaw, this speech from Sludge, noting this bit of information. Dems pass on using key power to kill Trump rules. Were you wondering about the use of the Congressional Review Act? We've mentioned it a few times it looked like they were going to make more aggressive use of it. They used it for a few things, but generally speaking, no. And if you were wondering, hey, when does that timeline run out? The answer is, I think we're done. Democrats in the Senate, Donald Shaw says, have a handy excuse for why they are not passing bills that would benefit regular people, but are opposed by their corporate donors. Their hands are tied, they say, because Republicans will threaten an insurmountable filibuster with conservatives in their caucus like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. They don't have enough votes to challenge or change filibuster rules. But even when they have chances to pass popular Democratic bills without getting filibustered, they don't even try. A little accusatory, but how can you avoid it? According to the firm Pillsbury Law, I've never run into Pillsbury Law, but I suppose if you poke them in the tummy with your forefinger, you'll recognize the guys. May 27th was the last day that Senate Democrats could have used the Congressional Review Act for fast-track rules to overturn last-minute Trump administration rules passed by passing resolutions of disapproval. That's just a description of how the Congressional Review Act procedure goes. A resolution of disapproval within X number of days of the new administration can undo, or actually it's within a certain number of days of the issuance of the old rules by the outgoing administration. But at any rate, a fast-track, non-filibusterable way of undoing last-minute damage from the Trump administration has come and gone. Rather than using that power to the fullest, Senate Democrats passed just 3 resolutions of disapproval within the 60-day window and let another 3 that had been proposed by their members effectively die as the deadline passed. The Trump rules that Democrats could have unilaterally overturned but chose not to include, and again here, though, I think we're still thinking, they could have done that in the face of united Republican opposition, if there was united Republican opposition, but only if, again, Manchin and Sinema come along for the ride. So there's still barriers to this. But the 3 that they could have done but chose not to included the ability for federally funded social services programs to discriminate against people based on sexual orientation or gender identity, actually the subject of one of the other decisions from the Supreme Court this morning. So I'm not certain how far that would have gone, because it sounds like the court actually went against that position today, and that would have more authority than the rule set by the previous administration anyway. But also out there, authority for the Social Security Administration to put their own attorneys in charge of appeals proceedings regarding rejections of benefits, and a measure making it more difficult for investors to submit shareholder resolutions to hold companies accountable on issues like climate change. When Trump took office in 2017, congressional Republicans passed 14 Congressional Review Act resolutions to gut Obama administration rules. The Republicans used it to weaken privacy protections for broadband customers, repeal the requirement that publicly traded companies disclose payments by resource extraction issuers, eliminate limits on states' authorities to drug test unemployment benefit applicants, and much more. Let's see. The GW Regulatory Studies Center senior policy analyst Daniel Perez analyzed proposed resolutions of disapproval and found that Democrats have been far less inclined to pursue using CRA powers than Republicans. It was a Republican invention, so that shouldn't surprise us, really. Democrats introduced just 27% of all disapproval resolutions over that period, Perez found. So why have Democrats been so shy about using the CRA? One reason they've given is that passing a CRA resolution bars the agency that issued the targeted rule from issuing new rules that are substantially the same. Some Democrats are concerned that this vague restriction on future regulations could hamstring agencies on regulations they would support, according to Politico. But that legal argument is bogus, says Jeff Hauser, director of the Revolving Door Project. Using the CRA would not preempt further efforts to regulate protectively and in accord with the missions each law grants the department or agency. Undoing a regulation doesn't preclude future affirmative regulation. I think floor time is scarce is a partial explanation, since recess seems sacrosanct to them, says Hauser. It's a good point, and true. And yeah, we probably should expect Republicans to make more aggressive use of the rule they invented in the Gingrich Revolution. But it does speak to a larger point, which is usually that members, like for instance, when they're screaming about what to do about the filibuster, people like Joe Manchin may say about the filibuster, or others who are wringing their hands about things like filibuster reform, say, well, if we were to get rid of the filibuster and to nuke the filibuster, Republicans would just turn around and do the same to us and victimize us with it next time they were in a majority. And I believe that that's true. But of course, other people believe right alongside that, and I think they're largely right, that the Republicans, if they run into a problem, will just nuke the filibuster themselves anyway. But apparently that's supposed to be a chief motivator for some of these hand-wringing Democrats. Well, be careful what you do, be careful what you wish for. It could be turned around and used against us. And that's a pretty powerful argument for them, and they end up not doing these things because they're afraid of retaliation from Republicans. At the same time, it's odd, though, that the same people don't use the same reasoning in saying, well, the CRA is actually quite a disruptive annoyance, and That should surprise no one, it having been invented by Newt Gingrich and the Republicans. But why you don't say to them, well, by the same logic, you should not abuse the Congressional Review Act by gutting all of the Obama-era legislation or regulation, for instance, because if you do, well, one day the shoe will be on the other foot and we will do it back to you. And apparently that's a threat that makes some sense to Republicans. They keep saying it about what they'll do if the Democrats do anything to change filibuster rules. So apparently that looms large in their imagination anyway. But I guess maybe they're just posing there too, because the truth is that they're finding out that Democrats won't use the same threat against them, which is also weird and asymmetrical and odd and inexplicable, except to say that, look, Democrats just love process and they don't like undoing things. And that puts you at an institutional disadvantage when it comes to dealing with the ruthless on the other side. I think you probably already knew that. I thought I'd just give you another example of it from a slightly different area of procedure. All right. I think that wraps things up, certainly for today. There's still a good couple of long reads for tomorrow, a good day for things on Friday. And if I can get my act together and edit and put together Darwin Darko's latest contribution for us, we can have his voice chime in tomorrow on a Friday. Always a good thing to have happen. In the meantime, what about the rest of your Thursday? Well, how about the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam, which comes up next. What's he got on tap? 21 Law and Order Back the Blue Republicans voted against awarding the Capitol Police those congressional gold medals, of course, for protecting them on January 6th. We heard the story, but let's get the nuance from Justice.
From netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
There's more, of course. The Biden administration is reviewing a judge's order to resume drilling auctions on federal lands. A Brennan Center for Justice survey found 1 in 3 U.S. elections officials feels unsafe on the job, with 1 in 6 reported being threatened by unhinged Trump supporters, and the Justice Department warned Missouri officials that the state cannot void federal gun rules.